Now, this case is just one example of how law enforcement accountability is changing. New research is showing how often officers are charged and convicted after shooting someone on duty. These data come from the Police Integrity Research Group at Bowling Green State University. By their count, since the year 2005, 155 on-duty officers have been charged with murder or manslaughter. 155. 51 of them have been convicted. 56 were not. 48 of those cases are still pending. Joining us now is this report's author. Phil Stinson is a professor of criminal justice at Bowling Green State. Professor Stinson, welcome to the program.
It's good to be with you.
Can you break apart some of the numbers about convictions for us? For example, how many of them are by jury? How many of these are verdicts handed down from the bench? Dig into that particular statistic a bit more.
Well, when we look at the cases, the 51 cases, and again, this is data that I've collected since 2005. And we're dealing with a very small sample here, but of those 155 officers charged, 21 of the officers actually entered guilty pleas. 29 were found guilty in jury trials, and just one of the officers was found guilty in a bench trial. In other words, a trial where the judge was sitting as the trier of fact without a jury present. So it's very rare in these cases that officers are actually charged, and it's even rarer that we see officers convicted in these cases. And it seems that quite oftentimes in the case of jury trials, that jurors are very reluctant to second-guess the split-second decisions of on-duty police officers in potentially violent street encounters. And we see the same thing with bench trials, because we've actually had, I think, 9 cases where officers were acquitted at bench trials. So very difficult to get a conviction in these cases.
Talk about that a little bit more, Professor, because that reticence to second-guess an officer is not just something that's cultural. The law also is designed to give officers a little bit of deference in terms of their split-second decision-making, right?
Well, the general standard under 2 cases from the U.S. Supreme Court of the 1980s is that a police officer is justified in using deadly force if the officer has a reasonable apprehension of an imminent threat of serious bodily injury or death being imposed against the officer or someone else. What we see in these cases is that's a reasonable officer standard. In other words, it's an objective standard, what a reasonable officer without the benefit of hindsight would have perceived. What we see in these cases is that in order for an officer to even be charged, let alone convicted, it has to be so over the top that their actions can't be rationally explained. And anything short of that, it's very difficult to get a conviction.
What did you make of the years in which these charges came? If you look at the list that's there right now, last year you noted was the year where you saw the most charges, 2021, followed by 2015, where there were 18 charges. How much of that do you think is impacted by just what was going on in the zeitgeist in the culture? I mean, George Floyd died in 2020, and then 2021, highest number of charges thus far. Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014, and then second highest number of charges in 2015. How much of this is cultural impact?
Well, we now know from the work of the Washington Post that between 900 and 1,000 times each and every year, since they've started collecting the data in 2015, that on-duty police officers shoot and kill someone. And as you said, from my research, the most we've seen in terms of officers charged is 21 last year, in the year 2021. However, when you dig down and look at those cases, what we see is that in one instance, 5 of the officers charged were officers from Oklahoma City. They were all charged out of the same shooting incident. So when we look at the number of incidents, it's amazingly static each year. We see roughly the same number of incidents. So when we see these numbers go up, it's not statistically significant in terms of increases. I had frankly expected after Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, and we really had a tipping point where everybody was paying attention to these incidents, whereas people weren't before that. I thought we'd see more officers being charged, but the fact of the matter is it's fairly consistent from year to year in terms of the numbers of officers charged. So out of 900 or 1,000 instances where on-duty officers shoot and kill someone, we're still only seeing about 2% of the time are officers actually charged in those cases.
What do you make of the ratio of the total number of on-duty shootings to the number of charges there are? I mean, every time an officer pulls the trigger, they're not necessarily going to hit somebody. They're not necessarily going to kill somebody. And that killing is not necessarily going to be called into question. I'm sure some people look at this number and say that makes sense. Others might look at the number and go, that's it for all of the shootings that there are. What do you make of that ratio?
Well, I have to assume in all the other instances where officers are not charged, it's because investigators and or prosecutors have made a determination that the officer's actions were legally justified. In other words, they decided that a reasonable officer in that situation would have perceived an imminent threat. The problem with that, though, is with that legal standard, there are many instances where officers are not charged, where police chiefs, where prosecutors have to tell the victim, surviving family members and loved ones, that while they're not charging the officer because they found the officer's actions were legally justified, they also found that the shooting was inappropriate, unnecessary, and perhaps violated agency policy. So there's a real disconnect. That's a very difficult concept to explain to a victim's family members. It doesn't really make sense to people. So I think we have to really reconsider this going forward. Part of the bigger idea of needing police reforms and reimagining policing, we also need to take a closer look at that legal standard and see if it's really workable in the current form.
One of the other statistics that came up was the object that the victim of the shooting was carrying that the officer used to make that split-second calculus, namely whether they had a gun or whether they did not. Of the officers who were charged, 59 of them were shooting a victim who had some kind of weapon or object other than a gun. 29 of the people who were shot were armed with a gun. That interested me partly because I can't tell you how many cases I've seen where an officer was in an encounter, suspect turns around, officer fires, says they think they saw something that looked like a weapon, and it turned out to be a scale for weighing cannabis or something like that, some object
or a cell phone
that turned out not to be dangerous or deadly.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're learning a lot more about these incidents from video recordings, from body-worn camera footage that officers have, from dash cam videos, from citizens who take videos with their smartphones, from surveillance cameras at people's homes, at businesses. And sometimes what we're seeing is that the statements made by officers after these incidents, the written reports they make, the statements that the officers involved make to investigators, what we're finding is often they're factually inconsistent with the video evidence. In other words, in the past, the police have always owned the narrative in these incidents, and the video footage is sometimes telling a different story. And I think that's important for investigators and prosecutors in making decisions and trying to determine what actually happened and not solely relying on the police narrative as the factual basis in making their decisions.
One more statistic I wanted to share. You also studied the racial breakdown of the officers in completed cases, meaning they were found either guilty or not guilty. We see that among non-black officers, 43 were convicted, 49 were not. Among black officers, 8 were convicted, 7 were not. So a slightly more even conviction rate for black officers, biasing ever so slightly toward convictions. Non-black officers a bit more likely to not be convicted than to be convicted. What did you make of that?
Well, not much yet, because we have such a small sample. The data, we just don't have enough data to draw any conclusions on it. I do think that it's important that we collect that data, and that over time, I'm hoping that, unfortunately, we'll have more cases, but that'll give us the opportunity to try to make sense and drill down on that and see if we see any statistically significant patterns that develop over time.
And very briefly, before I let you go, is the difficulty in the data, is it just a matter of time, the small data set, or have you found that there are impediments to getting data about law enforcement? We know there are gaps in terms of our overall statistical knowledge, even of how many times law enforcement officers fire their weapons. Are you finding impediments from law enforcement to getting the data you're looking for, or is it just typical kind of statistical challenges before we go?
Well, I don't rely on official data from law enforcement agencies. All of my research is based on 48 Google alerts I set up back in 2004 and 2005 that constantly crawl the Google News search engine, and we rely on that. Now, once we learn about these cases through the news media, we do try to get court records when they're publicly available or otherwise that we can get our hands on, and police reports, those kinds of things. But as the U.S. Justice Department has found, it's very difficult to collect data from the more than 18,000 state and local law enforcement agencies across the country, because those data collection efforts of the Justice Department are voluntary on the part of those agencies. They just, or even if there's some sort of requirement, many agencies just don't comply. So that's why I rely on other types of methodologies to collect data, because it's very difficult to collect data and rely on law enforcement agencies.
Bowling Green criminal justice professor Phil Stinson. Professor, I appreciate you making time. Thank you very much.
Oh, take care.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.